Hey there, viewers. Let me ask you this. If you knew the truth could ruin someone powerful, would you stay silent or speak out? Drop your thoughts in the comments because Diddy's former cellmate just took the stand, exposing dark secrets during an intense court hearing. And trust me, this explosive testimony changes everything. Buckle up. This is one story you don't want to miss. Let's dive in. Chapter 1. The New Cellmate. I've seen a lot during my time at MDC. Hardened criminals, men with nothing to lose, and others just trying to survive the system. But nothing could have prepared me for the day they moved me to a new cell. I didn't think much of it at first. Just another relocation, just another concrete box to spend my days. But the moment I stepped inside and laid eyes on who was sitting in that cell, I froze. My blood ran cold. It was Diddy. Yeah, that Diddy. The man who once walked red carpets like a king, surrounded by flashing lights and a sea of fans screaming his name. Now he was sitting there, in the same orange jumpsuit as the rest of us. But something about him, it didn't match the place. His posture, his expression, it was like prison didn't touch him. Like even behind bars, he still held all the power. When the guards locked the door behind me, I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I tried to play it cool, act like it didn't faze me, but trust me, when you're sharing a cell with someone like him, it's impossible to ignore. He didn't even glance up right away. He just sat there, back against the wall, like none of this meant anything to him. I dropped my stuff on the bottom bunk, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I've been around all kinds of guys, gang leaders, lifers, even a few politicians who fell from grace. But Diddy, he didn't fit the mold. When he finally lifted his head, his eyes met mine, and for a split second, I felt like I wasn't supposed to be there. Like I had walked into something bigger than I could understand. And trust me, I've been in this system long enough to know when someone's dangerous. But Diddy? He wasn't like the others. His danger wasn't about brute force. It was something else, something darker. "You knew?" he finally asked, his voice low, steady, too calm for a man locked in a cage. I nodded. "Yeah. Got moved this morning." He gave a small, knowing smile, like he already knew why I was there. But that didn't make sense. Hell, the guards barely told me anything before they tossed me in with him. "Better get used to it," he said quietly. "They move people around when they want to keep things quiet." I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't need to. In prison, you learn quickly that some things are better left unsaid. But there was this weight in the air, like the walls of that cell held secrets I wasn't supposed to know. And Diddy, he seemed to carry them effortlessly. For the first few hours, we didn't talk much. I figured that was best. But I couldn't stop watching him. Everything about the way he moved, the way he held himself, it was too calculated, too controlled. Even the most powerful guys I've shared a yard with eventually let their guard down. But not him. When the evening count rolled around, I saw something that made my stomach twist. The guard who came to check our cell, he wouldn't even make eye contact with Diddy. And that's not normal. These guards are used to dealing with the worst of the worst. But somehow, Diddy had them on edge. I tried to push the feeling aside, tell myself I was just imagining things. But then, right before lights out, he did something that made my blood run cold. I was lying on my bunk, pretending to read a book I found in the library, when I heard him whisper something under his breath. It was too quiet to catch at first, but the longer I listened, the clearer it became. A name. He kept repeating a name. I won't say it here, not because I'm scared, but because I know better. There are names you don't speak in a place like this. Names that carry weight, even behind locked doors. And if Diddy was saying that name, it meant something serious. I sat up, staring at him in the dark. "What did you say?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer, didn't even look at me, just kept muttering that name under his breath, over and over, like he was trying to burn it into the walls. At that moment, I realized something terrifying. Diddy wasn't just another inmate, and whatever he was wrapped up in, it was bigger, way bigger than anything I had ever been a part of. I should have asked for a cell transfer right then and there, but I didn't. I stayed, and in the days that followed, I learned things I wish I never knew. Because when you share a cell with a man like Diddy, the truth has a way of coming out. And some truths, they're too dangerous to keep locked away. Chapter 2. The Man Who Controlled Everything. The first time I spoke to Diddy, really spoke to him, I knew right away that this man wasn't like anyone else in MDC. I've shared cells with killers, gang leaders, and men who thought they ran things. But Diddy, he didn't just act like he had power, he was the power. It was like he had strings nobody could see, pulling and moving things exactly the way he wanted. And the craziest part? Even in a prison cell, stripped of his money and status, that power never left him. I remember that day clear as if it happened yesterday. I had been watching him, quietly, since the moment I got tossed into his cell. He moved like a man who wasn't worried about a damn thing. He didn't flinch when the guards made their rounds. He didn't react to the noise or the chaos echoing through the block. It was like everything around him was beneath him, like this whole prison was just a temporary inconvenience. After a while, I couldn't hold back my curiosity. I had to know. I had to understand how a man like him could sit there like nothing touched him. So, against my better judgment, I spoke. "You don't seem too worried about being here," I said, trying to keep my tone casual. "Most guys, they crack after a while." Diddy didn't look up right away. He just sat on the edge of his bunk, hands clasped together, like he was thinking about something way bigger than this place. When he finally turned his eyes toward me, a chill ran down my spine. There was no fear in his expression, just that same cold, calculating calm. He let the silence hang for a moment, like he was deciding whether I was even worth responding to. And then, with the faintest smirk curling at the corner of his mouth, he spoke. "Because I'm not most guys," he said quietly. I wanted to laugh it off, chalk it up to the usual arrogance you see from men who can't accept that they're locked in a cage. But there was something about the way he said it. He wasn't bragging. He wasn't trying to convince me. It was just a fact he knew better than anyone. I leaned back against the cold wall of the cell, trying to piece together the puzzle in front of me. "So what? You think you're above all this?" I asked, keeping my voice low. Diddy tilted his head slightly, his gaze locked onto mine. "Think," he repeated, his voice smooth, almost amused. "I know I am." And the way he said it? It wasn't bluster. It wasn't just talk. It was a warning, a subtle reminder that whatever power the prison thought it had over him, it wasn't real. I'll be honest, most guys in here talk a big game. They tell stories about who they were on the outside, about the empires they ran or the money they had. But Diddy, he didn't need to talk. Everything about the way he carried himself made it clear. He wasn't someone you could touch. And as the days passed, I started to see just how deep that power went. You see, in prison, nothing happens by accident. Every favor, every privilege, it's all controlled by the people who've built networks inside these walls. And somehow, Diddy had access to things nobody else did. I noticed it first with the food. While the rest of us were stuck eating the same bland, processed trays, Diddy's meals always seemed better, fresher. There were days he'd get things that weren't even on the commissary list. And the guards, they never said a word. One day, I couldn't hold back my curiosity. "How do you pull that off?" I asked, nodding toward the tray he was casually picking through, loaded with items I hadn't seen in months. He glanced at it like it was nothing. "It's not about what you know," he said, leaning back against the wall. "It's about who owes you." And that's when it hit me. Diddy wasn't just sitting in this prison. He was working it. Quietly, invisibly, like a puppeteer pulling strings behind the scenes. I started paying closer attention after that. The guards, these guys who made life hell for the rest of us, were practically scared of him. They never yelled at him, never checked his cell too thoroughly. It was like they knew better. One day, during the afternoon count, I watched one of the younger guards, new guy, fresh out of training, try to press Diddy about something. Maybe he didn't know who he was dealing with. But when Diddy stood up and fixed that cold, unbothered stare on him, you could practically see the blood drain from the kid's face. He backed off without another word. And when he walked away, Diddy just shook his head, like it was all beneath him. "People respect power," he said later that night, almost like he was explaining a basic truth, even when they pretend they don't. I didn't press him for details. I knew better than to ask too many questions. But as time went on, I started to realize that Diddy wasn't just surviving an MDC. He was running it in ways I couldn't even wrap my head around. And here's the thing. Most men in here lose themselves after a while. The routine, the isolation, it breaks them down piece by piece. But Diddy, he thrived in it. While the rest of us counted days, he was playing a game none of us could see. But even with all that power, there was something beneath the surface, something cold and dangerous. And every once in a while, when he thought no one was watching, I'd catch glimpses of it. One night, as the block settled into that eerie prison quiet, I heard him talking, low and deliberate. At first, I thought he was just thinking out loud. But when I really listened, I realized he wasn't talking to himself. He was giving instructions. It wasn't loud enough to catch the full conversation, but I heard enough to know that whatever he was involved in, it didn't stop at these prison walls. And that chilled me to the bone. I didn't ask questions after that. I kept my head down, my mouth shut, and tried not to think too hard about what I had gotten myself into. Because sharing a cell with Diddy, it wasn't just about survival. It was about not knowing too much. Because in here, knowing too much could get you killed. And no matter how much power he had, I knew one thing for sure. Whatever secrets Diddy was keeping, they were darker than anything I'd ever seen. Chapter 3. The Hidden Threat. I sat alone in my office, the hum of fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. Diddy's report was still on my mind, those chaotic blood values and bizarre contradictions. But nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared me for what I was about to find next. I reached into my locked drawer and pulled the file back out, my fingers tense as I flipped through the pages. I wasn't even sure why I was doing this. I should have handed it over and forgotten about it. But something about this case, it wouldn't let me go. At first, I thought I missed something, maybe a mistake. But as I turned another page, a red tab caught my eye. Confidential. I frowned. That wasn't normal. We don't put confidential tabs on routine blood work. With a quick glance toward the door, I made sure it was locked before I peeled the paper back. And when I did, my blood ran cold. HIV positive. I blinked. Once. Twice. My mind refused to process it. But the words were right there, clear as day. Not inconclusive. Not a false positive. Confirmed. Final. I dropped the paper onto my desk, my hand trembling. In my years working medical in the 1700s, I had never seen something like this attached to a high-profile inmate's chart. Sure, we had cases. A lot of cases. But this was different. I tried to think rationally, but the questions poured in faster than I could stop them. How? How does someone like Diddy, one of the most powerful and protected inmates in this entire system, end up with something like this? It didn't make sense. The MDC was locked down tighter than Fort Knox. Every interaction monitored, every visitor cleared. There weren't many ways something like this could happen in here. Unless it didn't happen here. I leaned back in my chair, heart pounding in my chest. Was this from his past life? The one outside these walls? I knew the rumors. Everybody did. The wild parties, the power trips, the things no one dared to say out loud. But those rumors don't show up in blood work. This did. This was real. I exhaled sharply, running a hand through my hair. And if this got out, if the other inmates caught wind of it, he was already a target. This would make it worse, a lot worse. I tried to shake it off, to convince myself it wasn't my problem. But I couldn't stop imagining Diddy out there in the yard, walking like nothing touched him, like he still owned everything. The way he held himself, the way the other inmates still backed off when he passed. He had no idea. Or maybe he did. Maybe that's why he acted like nothing could touch him. But if he knew, why wasn't he doing anything about it? I glanced back at the report. The viral load numbers were off the charts. This wasn't some new diagnosis. This was advanced. He'd been living with this for years. And whether it caught up with him inside or out, it was catching up. Fast. A knock on the door jolted me out of my thoughts. My heart leapt to my throat. For a split second, I felt like I was caught, like I'd seen something I was never meant to see. "Who is it?" My voice cracked slightly. "It's Adams," one of the other medical techs called through the door. "Inmate 4729's report. Warden wants it, now." Diddy. I swallowed hard. I wanted to tell him no, to make some excuse about needing to review the numbers again. But I couldn't, not with the warden's eyes on this. I slid the report back into the folder, pausing for just a moment as my gaze fell on those two chilling words again. HIV positive. I closed the folder and handed it over without another word. When the door shut behind him, I sat there, numb. There was no fixing this, no covering it up. The truth was in the blood. And the truth, it always comes out. I tried to go about the rest of my shift like nothing had changed, but my mind wouldn't let it go. Why wasn't anyone doing anything? Why wasn't this all over the prison? With an inmate like Diddy, news usually travels fast. But there was silence, almost like someone was keeping it that way. Later that night, when most of the prison had gone quiet, I saw him again. They were moving him back from the legal wing. 2 guards flanked him on either side, but it didn't look like they were protecting the prison from him. It looked like they were protecting him from the prison. He still had that same expression, cold, arrogant, unbothered. But for the first time, I noticed something else, a weight, like he was carrying a secret no one else knew. Except now, I did, and it terrified me. As he passed by my window, he turned his head, and our eyes locked. My pulse quickened. For a split second, I felt like he could see right through me, like he knew I'd read what no one else was supposed to. But then he smirked, like none of it mattered, and just like that, he was gone. But that report wasn't going anywhere. And whether he liked it or not, his secrets were running out of time. Chapter 4. Haunted by the Truth. After that night, after hearing what Diddy told me, I wasn't the same. I couldn't be. Something inside me shifted, broke. I've heard my share of horror stories in prison, but nothing like that. Nothing even close. I didn't sleep. Not really. Whenever I closed my eyes, I'd hear his voice, smooth, calm, and cold, repeating those words like a curse. And worse than the words themselves were the images my mind painted. Faces I'd never seen but could almost feel. Faces of the innocent people he said he'd destroyed. For the first time since I'd been locked up, I was scared. Not of the other inmates, not of the guards. I was scared of the man sleeping a few feet away from me. At first, I thought I could shake it off, convince myself I misunderstood, or maybe even that he was lying to mess with my head. But deep down, I knew the truth. Diddy wasn't just bragging. He wasn't making this up. He was confessing. And that knowledge, it felt like poison in my blood. I tried to go about my days like normal, but everything felt off. My appetite was gone. Food tasted like ash in my mouth. I could barely swallow without feeling like I was going to be sick. My hands would shake when I tried to write letters. My nerves were shot. And sleep? Forget it. I'd lie there in the dark, staring at the cracked ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the prison. Every time I drifted off, I'd jolt awake, sweating, heart pounding, the sound of his voice echoing through my head. And Diddy? He acted like nothing had happened. If anything, he seemed more relaxed, more in control, like he knew that what he'd told me was just another weight for me to carry, another chain to wrap around my neck. It was like I was being tested. And the longer I stayed in that cell with him, the more I felt like I was losing myself. I started avoiding him. At first, I tried to play it cool, keeping our conversation short and shallow. But I couldn't hide the truth. I know he saw the way my hands shook, the way I flinched when he spoke, the way I avoided making eye contact for too long. And Diddy? He noticed. Of course he noticed. "You're quiet lately," he said one day, leaning back on his bunk like a king on his throne. "Something bothering you?" I swallowed hard, keeping my eyes on the floor. "Nah," I mumbled. "Just tired." He laughed, a low, knowing sound that made my skin crawl. "Yeah," he said. "Prison has a way of wearing a man down, but you'll adjust." His words hung in the air, heavy and full of meaning. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was enjoying this, that he'd liked knowing I was unraveling. And maybe that was the scariest part. The things he'd done, the lives he'd ruined, it didn't weigh on him. Not one bit. After that conversation, I started keeping my distance. I'd wake up earlier than usual, get out of the cell before count, and linger in the yard as long as I could. At meals, I sat with other guys, anyone but him. And at night, I faced the wall pretending to sleep, just to avoid meeting his eyes. But no matter how much space I tried to put between us, I couldn't escape the weight of what I knew. One night, I found myself in the rec room pacing back and forth while the other inmates watched TV. My mind was racing, spinning in a million directions. Should I report him? Would anyone even believe me? And if they did, what would happen next? Because there was one thing I couldn't forget. Something that kept me frozen in place. Diddy wasn't just another inmate. He had power. And if he could do those things on the outside, what was stopping him from doing worse on the inside? I tried to convince myself that staying quiet was the safest option, that speaking out would only get me hurt, or worse. But the truth gnawed at me, day and night, like a splinter I couldn't pull out. And Diddy? He kept watching me. Every now and then I'd catch him studying me, calm, patient, like a predator waiting for its prey to slip up. And the more I tried to stay away, the more it felt like he was pulling the strings, keeping me exactly where he wanted. One day, while I was cleaning up after chow, he leaned over and spoke quietly, too quietly for anyone else to hear. "You know," he said, his voice smooth as silk, "sometimes it's better not to know things you can't handle." I froze, the tray trembling in my hands. He smiled, that cold, knowing smile, and leaned back as if nothing had happened. That was when I realized the truth. I wasn't just another cellmate to Diddy. I was a pawn, and he was playing a game I couldn't even begin to understand. From that point on, I barely spoke a word to him. Every conversation felt like walking through a minefield. One wrong step, and I'd set something off. My days became a blur of tension and paranoia, and at night, I barely closed my eyes. The worst part? I knew he liked it. Diddy wasn't just surviving prison. He was thriving in it. And me, I was barely hanging on. But even as I tried to keep my head down, one thought kept clawing its way back to the surface, something I couldn't ignore. If he'd confessed those things to me, what else was he hiding? And if he was willing to share even a fraction of the truth, what other secrets were buried beneath the surface? Chapter 5. Too sick to stay. I've handled some rough cases at MDC, inmates barely clinging to life, broken bodies from fights, untreated illnesses that eat them alive from the inside out. But nothing, and I mean nothing, comes close to what I'm seeing with Diddy. By all logic, he shouldn't even be here anymore. Not like this. Not with what I know. The morning started like any other. I was in my office, buried under the never-ending pile of medical reports, updating the system with the latest inmate health logs. Most of it was routine. Blood pressure checks, medication management, the usual wear and tear from life behind bars. But when I got to Diddy's file, I froze. His latest test results had come in overnight, and they were worse, much worse. His immune system, crashing fast. His liver, on the verge of failure. And his blood work. Let's just say, I've never seen numbers like this on a living man. If he was any other inmate, hell, if he was anyone else at all, he would have already been transferred to a prison hospital. No question. MDC is no place for someone this sick, not with these conditions. And yet, here he was, still in general population, still walking around like none of this touched him. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't let this slide. I pulled up the formal transfer forms, my hands shaking slightly as I typed out the request. I laid it out clearly. If we didn't move Diddy to a specialized medical facility soon, he wouldn't survive. It should have been open and shut. But nothing with Diddy is ever that simple. I filed the paperwork and sent it through the proper channels, thinking I'd done my job. But by lunch, I got a call from the warden himself, a call that made the hairs on my neck stand up. "Drop the transfer," he said, his voice cold and tight. "It's not happening." I blinked. "Sir, with all due respect, if we don't move him, he's going to die. He needs care. We can't provide here." I said, "Drop it." His voice cut through the line like a blade. "This isn't your call. Not with him." And then he hung up. I sat there, staring at the phone, my heartbeat thudding in my ears. It didn't make sense. Why keep Diddy here when his body was breaking down? Unless someone wanted him to stay. Later that day, I made my usual rounds. When I got to Diddy's cell, he was sitting on his bunk, leaning back against the wall with that same cold, unbothered expression. But I could see the cracks, the way his hands trembled slightly, the faint sweat on his brow. No matter how much he tried to hide it, his body was wearing down. "You're getting worse," I said, stepping inside. "You know that, right?" He didn't look up. "I'm fine." "You're not fine, Diddy. Your liver's shutting down. Your immune system's falling apart. You can't stay here." That's when he looked at me, really looked at me. And for the first time since this whole mess started, I saw something behind his eyes that scared me. Fear. "I don't need to go anywhere," he said, his voice low and even. "I've handled worse." "You don't get it," I snapped, frustrated by his arrogance. "This isn't a game. You stay here, you're not going to make it out alive." He laughed softly under his breath, a sound that sent a chill crawling up my spine. "You think this place can kill me?" He shook his head. "They've been trying for years." I wanted to push harder, to make him understand just how serious this was. But something about the way he spoke, like he already knew. And worse, like he didn't care. I left his cell, my head spinning. The whole situation felt wrong. And the more I dug, the deeper it went. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the warden's words over and over. Drop it. Why? Why was Diddy untouchable even when he was dying? The next morning, I tried again. I filed another transfer request, this time bypassing the warden and sending it directly to the Bureau of Prisons medical director. I wasn't going to let this go. But before the day was out, my request came back. Denied. No explanation, no reasons, just denied. Someone was blocking this at the highest levels, and whoever they were, they didn't want Diddy leaving MDC. By the end of the week, his condition had worsened. He barely touched his food. His weight was dropping fast. Every medical sign screamed the same thing. He wouldn't last much longer. And yet, through it all, he never broke. One afternoon, as I checked his vitals, I finally asked the question that had been eating at me. "Why are you still here, Diddy? Why aren't they letting me transfer you?" He smiled, a slow, knowing smile. "Because," he said quietly, "I'm exactly where I need to be." I didn't understand what he meant, not fully. But one thing was clear. Someone wanted him here. And as long as he stayed in MDC, he wasn't just another inmate. He was a secret they were willing to protect, no matter the cost. I still file a report every week, documenting his decline, laying out the medical facts, the legal obligations. But no matter how much I push, nothing changes. And as much as I hate to admit it, I'm starting to wonder if Diddy's right. Because in this prison, nothing touches him, not even death.